Okay, let's turn to the last of the threats that really engage value creation, which is the threat of substitution. In the article, as well as kind of in day-to-day use of the framework, it's relatively straightforward to think about substitutes on the buyer side in an industry. Substitutes create a cap on the prices that buyers will pay here. So for example, in the motorcycle industry, a substitute for a motorcycle might be to buy a jet ski or a speedboat, or to take the subway, or to buy a sports car, or if what you're doing with the motorcycle is getting into, let's say, a motorcycle club, an alternative might be to start a rock band, or to engage in extreme sports, something like that. A substitute for a computer, buying a new personal computer, might be to keep your old one and go out and buy a smartphone or something like that. So the idea is you're looking here on the buyer side for products or services outside the industry that you're studying that provide some of the same kinds of value as the industry generates for you, for buyers. And to think about, okay, as the buyer is considering buying a motorcycle, or let's say a personal computer, are they thinking about that outside alternative and kind of comparing razor's edge? Are they comparing the value of those outside alternatives with the product that you're offering here? Substitutes are going to create a cap on the prices that buyers will pay. Now, another facet of the threat of substitution that's not as strongly emphasized in Porter's work, although it's implicit, is developed more extensively in the decades since Mike originally developed the framework here, is that the idea here is that substitutes can create, as well, in a symmetric sense, a floor on the prices that suppliers require. In other words, think of the beer business buying aluminum cans. The aluminum can manufacturers for years, may try to raise the price of aluminum cans on the beer companies. At some point, the beer companies may look at the aluminum cans and say, you know what, maybe we want to try to find some alternative than putting beer in aluminum cans. If the prices of those aluminum cans start to get too high, then the beer industry may look at alternatives such as putting beer in glass bottles, putting it in barrels and so on, and delivering it differently here. The idea here is that just as buyers are thinking about alternatives here, suppliers are also negotiating with the industry, and the industry may be looking at outside alternatives, substitutes in this example. Spiros, let me start over here. Let me start over here on the threat of substitution. I want to try to explain this more clearly in another shot at this. Okay, let's turn to the third of the forces that really shape value creation in an industry, namely the threat of substitution. Now, in that 1979 article that was reissued in 2008, Porter focuses primarily on the threat of substitution on the buyer side. Of course, substitutes are products and services outside an industry that create the same value or compete to create the same value that the industry seeks to create. Okay, so for example, on the buyer side, in the motorcycle industry, an alternative would be, to buy a speedboat or to start a rock band or something like that. Now, what we also have learned in the last few decades, inspired by Porter's work and engaged by him as well, is that there may be a threat of substitution on the supply side as well. If those makers of tires that are supplying the motorcycle industry here can't make enough money in their interactions with the motorcycle industry, those manufacturers may say, hey, let's take our tire making capacity and devote it to some other use than making motorcycles, because we're just not getting enough of a return on investment here. And that constitutes a threat of substitution too. If I'm an employee of a company and my wage isn't high enough year after year after year, even if I love my job, I do love my job as a professor, my wage is not high enough relative to my outside options, I may say to myself, I can't really afford to keep this job anymore. I got to go do something else, even though I'd rather stay in the job that I'm in terms of the the spiritual, intellectual, and emotional benefits of the job, I can't afford to turn down these outside alternatives. I have to choose something else. So that's an example of a threat of substitution on the supply side. A better alternative for suppliers than working with the industry here. Now, the actual threat of substitution depends not just on the prices of those outside alternatives, but also on their performance attributes. So, for example, here, if I'm potentially thinking about buying a motorcycle, I may say, well, wait a minute, a motorcycle is going to cost me $10,000, say, but a speedboat is going to cost me, $16,000. I've got to think about, is it worth it? Let's say I think that a motorcycle is going to be, let's say I imagine that it's going to be relatively harder for me to maintain or something like that. I may choose the speedboat. Let's say I want to hang out more with my family and friends, and I think the motorcycle is not as good as the speedboat in actually creating options for me to spend time with the people that I aspire to spend time with, say. I may choose that speedboat even though it's more expensive because I have blended purchase criteria that reflect not just the speed that both motorcycles and the speedboat provide, but also the sociability of the two things, and the speedboat's outperforming here. Alternatively, let's suppose that I'm a worker trying to think about whether or not to change professions here. Well, you know what? Let's say I'm thinking about leaving my job. I love my job, but the salary is too low, and I'm looking at these outside alternatives. Well, after doing some research, maybe I'll discover that even though I could make, 20 or 30 or 50% more in an outside job, I just can't tolerate the conditions of work underneath that alternative. Let's suppose I'm an actor and I just absolutely love my job, but I can't make enough money at it, and I look at becoming a waiter or waitress. Here, I realize I can make maybe 20 or 30% more money or 50% more money, but gosh, the hours are terrible. There's no job security. I've got to tolerate a lot of boredom and so on. I may say, look, it's worth it for me to stay in my job as an actor even though I can't make it as much money here. So the level of the threat of substitution depends not just on that outside economic profile, but also on the performance there. There are also functional equivalents in substitution that are sometimes not obvious, such as when buyers decide not to buy anything at all. I may look at speedboats and motorcycles and say, oh my goodness, it's too confusing. Next year, I think there's going to be a better speedboat that's going to come out. I'm just going to wait and not buy at all. That's a substitute for buying a motorcycle. And similarly, if I'm an actor thinking about whether or not to become a waitress, I may say, you know what, neither of these alternatives are attractive. I'm out of it. I'm going to take a sabbatical and maybe go back to school or just shut down my engagement in the workforce. Or similarly, that tire manufacturer that's supplying the motorcycle industry may say, I can't make any money at all in tires. I'm going to shut down production overall. So when you're assessing the threat of substitution, look from both the buyer side and the supplier side and think about those functional equivalents.